Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, folks, no matter where the heck in the world you are. It's V the Gorilla coming to you live on this edition of the Geostrategic Hour with my main man who needs no introduction. I am, of course, talking about the brain trust himself, the one and only Matthew Ehret. And I can't begin to tell you about the books that he's written. And folks, if you haven't gotten his books, go get it. The volume of two, the Symphony of Two Americas, Volume 1, Volume 2, Volume 3, and Volume 4, as well as the incredible works by his wife, Cynthia, The Empire on Which the Black Sun Never Sets. Is that how it goes? Yes, there you go.
You're one of the first people who's been able to actually recall the entire title, but yeah. That's correct. Yeah.
Phenomenal books, folks. If you want to know the undergirdings of where we were, where we are, and where looks like we're headed, you might want to pick that up and put that on your reading list. And with that being said, back from his European tour, the rock star himself, Matthew. Good morning, buddy. Good afternoon. Where are you right now? I don't even know where. Are you back home? Are you back in the Great North?
Back to the Great North, cold, windy, snow-ridden Montreal, and I missed the south of France. That was fun. But we've been doing a little exploratory venturing about to add a little bit of firsthand coloring to some of the research that Cynthia and I are doing. And since we've both been on kind of deep dives in the last few years, especially going into some of the more occult underpinnings shaping a lot of the big events, the big destructive events in world history, we decided to go and actually see some of the terrain that we're writing about from afar firsthand a little bit, which was a fun experiment. And we did, like you said, a few things. We went down to Prague for a week, Prague being a center of Bohemia. I mean, that's Bohemia. We went down to the central command center of many of the Black Mass and other Rosicrucian workings. That's where the Rosicrucians came out and appeared on the stage in history in that form, at least for the first time, which inaugurated the fire starters. They were the fire starters that launched,
igniting the fire, the fire in the minds of men. It was the quote I remember from them.
That was it. Yeah, and they promised to usher in, of course, a new golden age that was promised at the time by this invisible army of enlightened higher souls who were organizing in the wings of kingdoms and governments, ready to throw off the shackles of tyranny of the Habsburg Empire and finally unleash an age of freedom and brotherhood and enlightenment and all of these good things. Now, the fact was, what they did unleash was the 30 Years' War. And they got one of their
well, the disclaimer was after much wanton death and chaos and destruction.
Yeah, right. That's
and then maybe we might enter.
Well, see, so this actually might be a fun theme that we sort of dovetailed with throughout today's conversation, is that one of the key figures behind this operation that Cynthia's been writing about, and that we got to see some of the terrain when we were up in Prague. We got to see the Prague Castle and some of the hideouts, which was kind of fun. But there was this figure named Michael Meyer, who's an English alchemist, a Kabbalist, and a key figure behind the Rosicrucian fervor that was started in 1616 or so, around that time. And then in 1617, there was the Confessio that was released as an anonymous document circulating all across Europe. And then another one called the Chemical Wedding in 1618, which was the third big Rosicrucian manifesto. Of course, the 30 Years' War is really ushered in the year later. But Michael Meyer is a sorcerer who's known for having configured what is essentially known as the Phoenix working, the Operation Phoenix, as an alchemical geopolitical breaking down and recombining a solvate coagula type of idea, but doing it from a metaphysical political standpoint. Not dissimilar from what you could see people, some of these later generation sorcerers doing as they took control of U.S. intelligence after the Second World War and created things like MK Ultra, which was designed to do a solvate coagula with first individual minds put through trauma, mind control. They would be broken down in order to be recombined with the help, of course, of drugs. So the fact that Michael Meyer plays a directing role, along with a few other people like Valentin André, These are people who are following Francis Bacon's network. The followers of John Dee earlier had really, I mean, John Dee was in with Edward Kelly, was in Bohemia. He was organizing Emperor Rudolph and trying to create this occult black magician network that would do exactly what they ended up doing a generation later. So you had these people, these creeps going about it. So what did they do? Well, what they did is they focused on a weak-minded figure, a prince by the name of Frederick V. And Frederick V became what's known as the Elector Palatine. I don't know if there's any connection to the language used by George Lucas later on in Star Wars for Emperor Palpatine, but what I do know is that the Palatine Hill also played a big role in ancient Rome as a sacred center of cult control. So there might be something there with the specific choice of name of the Palatinate. But the thing was, this guy was married off to a woman who was the daughter of James I, who was the Stuart king who had taken control of England. And James I was nominally, I think he was a Calvinist, but he was superstitious as hell, and maybe rightfully so. He did have a belief that witches were out, witch covens had been organized to kill him, and he wrote books on demonology and other things. He was a bit of a paranoid person, but his daughter, Elizabeth, he married off to Frederick, a young guy, young girl, and they were both worked on psychologically to believe that they were essentially two new messiah figures to usher in a new age, that they were, and they had, this palace worshipping the Apollonian deity, not dissimilar to what King Louis XIV also had with his Apollonian worship, his sun cult in France. But all that to say, they then were induced to accept this plan, which was insane, an insane plan, which was to essentially Frederick V basically dubbed himself the new emperor. And of course, he was in charge of the Protestant League, which had been already organized as a fake, kind of like a NATO collective security pact of the day. So any individual who gets in a fight within the Protestant League, it would pull in other members of the Protestant League into some mutual defense, program, which is exactly what happened. And he declared himself emperor. And obviously the Habsburgs were not happy with that. And they smacked him down with the battle at Snowy Mountain in 1620. His forces were wiped out. It was a massacre, but it wasn't just a massacre, because that battle and the loss of that battle made people go crazy because of the level of hope of a new golden age that the Rosicrucians had promised they would usher in with Frederick V was so devastated that people had no mooring left psychologically to hold on to. And they went batshit fucking nuts. And for the next 30 years, with that loss of common sense and desperation, there was a complete economic breakdown too. You had wars. You had provocateurs being sent to kill Protestants, calling themselves, so you had these provocateurs doing massacres of Protestant villages, saying, "Long live the Catholics, down with Martin Luther." And then they would disappear. You didn't really know who they were, but that's what they said. And then inversely, you had Catholic villages being massacred by Protestants, most of whom it seems by Protestant mercenaries and things. But I don't think none of these mercenaries, these provocateurs on the left or on the right, were actually representatives of the actual Protestants or Catholics by and large. But it seems like this higher hand was there in the same way that we've seen examples of Syrian villages periodically being massacred with a few people left alive. And they're led to believe that it was Bashar al-Assad's people who came in. And you're like, how did you know that? How do you know that the people who killed all of the members of your village were Bashar al-Assad's men? And they're like, oh, because they wore black masks and they were so well armed. You can't be that well armed unless you're working for the government. And they said, "Long live Bashar al-Assad," as they were killing my family. It's like, well, how do you know that they weren't proxies being used to get you to think that it's the government clamping down, but it's actually the same CIA backers of ISIS who are actually behind it? And they're just so traumatized, they can't even think about that. But it seems like that MO has been going on for a long time. So all that to say, we got to see how exactly these fires were lit. And then we went down to Germany, which was interesting because we went down to a little place called Osnabrück, which is a few minutes away from Munster. So we went to Munster and Osnabrück. Now, these two places are where the Peace of Westphalia was signed, like, so the peace treaty. And that peace treaty was what finally in 1648 put an end to that Rosicrucian forever war, where again, like, a third of Germany was massacred. There were no jobs except for people who wanted to dig bodies, or grave diggers, and people who wanted to become mercenaries. But outside of that, that was the economy. People had no choice in this land of forever wars except to become a squire, a knight, and work for a lord, because there were thousands of little battling feudal dukedoms, fiefdoms. Look at a map of Germany during the 30 Years' War, and you could see, like, Prussia, Germany, the Palatinate. There's like thousands of little princely kingdoms, dukedoms, fiefdoms, each one with their own territorial claims, and all willing, some Protestant, some Catholic, but all willing to go to war and expend massive amounts of hired help in their wars to gain a few feet of extra territory here or there. And that was just the norm that people had adapted to during that time of forever wars. It was like a sick joke where these oligarchs were laughing at people. And the only thing that managed to put an end to that bloodbath that spread to Denmark, to the Netherlands, everywhere it had spread. And it was the maneuvering of certain figures around especially Jules Mazarin, who was like a grand strategist, Cardinal Jules Mazarin of France, who was a follower of Henry of Navarre, Henry IV, who was the assassinated king of 1610, who was killed because he was trying to stop the Protestant League from going to the next stage under the Rosicrucian and Venetian influence of Paolo Sarpi. There's a book, actually, I'm just reading. I put it away, never mind. There's a book actually going through, oh yeah, here it is.
See, folks, every single book back there, he's read.
So this is the book, Paolo Sarpi, the official biography by David Wooten, Between Renaissance and Enlightenment. And in this book, Paolo Sarpi it goes through how he literally oversaw the murder of Henry of Navarre. I got a whole thing on that. I'm going to make an article out of that. But all that to say, Henry of Navarre was the grand strategist who put an end to the oligarchist wars of France. Because before that, from 1560 to 1593, 94, you had 30 years of wars between Protestants and Catholics in France. This is before the 30 Years' War was sparked in Bohemia. It was in France. But France, under Henry of Navarre, had the wits to stop it from happening. That was the Edict of Nantes, which allowed for legalizing Protestantism and creating a healing process premised around or taking down these corrupt princes and oligarchs who had gotten rich, wealthy, and powerful over the course of the bloodletting ritual that was the wars in France. And number two, unleashing massive economic development. So using the power of the nation state as the proto-nation state in order to direct the flow of capital from the treasuries into internal improvements, roads, hospitals, canal building was going on in France under Henry of Navarre and Sully, who was his key strategist. Ultimately, you had a disposable asshole who was sent out to stab him to death, which did happen, and France went into turmoil. So the followers of Henry of Navarre's program, which also were the followers of King Louis the 11th's program as well, because Navarre situated himself in the tradition of King Louis the 11th, the founder of the first modern nation state as we know it, and who inspired King Henry VII of England to do the same thing when he set up the Tudor kingdom in England in the 1480s. But this is the key thing, is that you had this whole tradition of a philosopher king idea that was premised around the concept that we have to stop the age of wars, we have to stop the oligarchists, and we have to introduce an idea of the well-being of society that animates the behavior of credit generation and everything else. So this is what was done then by Henry of Navarre. When Jules Mazarin came in, he worked very hard for over a decade to finally organize a treaty that could be agreed upon by all belligerents within the 30 Years' War of Germany. And France was trusted because France had gotten their shit together. They had created a unified nation. They had an idea of development that was absent in other parts of Europe. So they were generally trusted. They had and finally, when you look at the Peace of Westphalia that was agreed upon, it was signed in two places. One where the Protestant delegations met in Munster, and the other one in Osnabrück where the Catholics met. They still weren't ready to like hang out together physically, but they signed this treaty. It's a long treaty, something like, well over 100 clauses are in it. But the key thing that made it work was, well, there were three things. Number one, its first two articles, the preamble of it, is the key that infuses meaning into the interpretation of every other article, because it could otherwise get a little tedious. This person allocates this amount of land to their territory. This person recognizes this other adjacent nation's territory and wants this canal, so it gets kind of legalistic and heavy. However, the key thing, just like the American Constitution, is the preamble, which introduces the spirit and intention of the law. And in the first article of the Peace of Westphalia that Mazarin orchestrated is the principle of the benefit of the other, and that all laws must be read through the first act, which is that all definitions of the good and self-interest must be defined around the benefit of your neighbor, which is a very Christian principle that sounds all nice and mushy as words, but when animating the law, it takes on a power unlike anything humanity has ever seen. And so that principle of the benefit of the other, and it's a beautiful thing that people could Google and just read the first couple of articles. The second article deals with forgiveness of all transgressions, that all sins and transgressions done during the course of war and crimes done in the course of war have to be forgotten as we look towards the future. Those two things are very, very important. The third thing that's not in the peace treaty itself, but is in the actual policies that were made possible by this relative peace that occurred, was the idea of internal developments to create mega projects. And here we have things like the Midi Canal, the project that was begun under Charlemagne, but it couldn't be finished, and that Da Vinci tried to advance in his time when he went to France after there was a hit out for his life because of the work he had been doing with Machiavelli in trying to organize the League of Cambrai to destroy Venice in 1508, 1509, and it failed. Venice succeeded at destroying the League. But Da Vinci had to escape to save his life and went to France, where he got sanctuary under King Louis the 12th. But he tried under that time to organize his genius towards helping the nation really break free of the system of empire. And the Midi Canal was the biggest infrastructure endeavor ever seen before, and he couldn't do it in his lifetime. But then under the course of Mazarin and then his prodigy, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the great finance minister of France, who was also, he declared war on the entire deep state. The swamp that he drained in France was incredible. The House of Orleans and others really, anyway, there's a whole story. I wrote a whole essay and a book about this, actually. But that he then began to emit public credit, because now your treasury is not being wasted away in war. And you could redirect the treasury and the behavior of credit, the idea of what credit and what capitalism is, towards things that involve the building up the society. And you had the greatest canal building ever seen before in history, not just with the Midi Canal, but so many roads, bridges. There were something like 800 bridges built up during that time. New academies, things like the Royal Academy of France and other academies of arts and industry. And also the important thing was the growth of the private sector. So entrepreneurs began to grow, to build the types, because people needed to emerge to do the jobs to build these big things. And that required private initiative, who would then get grants sponsored or covered by the state in part, not always. But then that would then be used to compete, to see who could come up with the best engineering problem solving, who could carry out for the cheapest price at the highest quality this or that part of a design or a project, not dissimilar from how China has been arranging its foreign Belt and Road projects in places like Tanzania and Africa, but Tanzania especially, where you have something like 4 different rail companies that competed in, that are all co-building different parts of a rail grid that China put the impetus in. But, it's it's not being done in some monolithic, communist state like top down way entirely. It's a balance of the top and the bottom working together. So all that to say, this is the sort of thing that I had a fun time just experiencing coming out of Prague, going to Münster, Osnabrück, seeing the environment, and also appreciating the Jesuit symbols everywhere. Like, I would say 4 out of 5 churches that I saw in Prague that Cynthia and I went into were replete with Jesuit solar symbolism. The 16-ray sun and the IHS symbolism everywhere. And then the same thing in Münster and Osnabrück. You start seeing the Jesuit symbolisms everywhere. And one thing that's interesting here is that, and then we ended up going to Avignon in the southern France. I'll say something about that. But what's interesting about the Jesuits is what's become increasingly clear is that the Rosicrucians were effectively the left-hand expression of the Jesuit entity, that the Jesuits and the Rosicrucians were 2 sides of the same alchemical working. Now, how does that work? And this is Frances Yates, actually. This is not our research, but Cynthia's been composing a lot of this in her new series. But what is Frances Yates? So Frances Yates is the most authoritative scholar on Rosicrucian history. She herself is an admirer, a high-level member of the club. I don't think she's necessarily a Rosicrucian. Maybe she is, but she's a part of the Warburg Institute, and she was writing a lot of these essays.
Real quick, Matt, for those who are just listening to this first time, and I just realized this, those members that belong to the Rose and the Cross, the Rosicrucians, can you tell the layperson who's hearing this the first time, who the heck are the Rosicrucians, and why are they so very important? They're one of the oldest secret societies. But go ahead, Matty.
Yeah, well, they're an iteration of an already existent, very old, ancient order that emerged in one form. I think that they are directly tied to the Templars, the Knights of Solomon's Temple, after the Templars were taken down by the figures of Philip le Bel, Philip IV of France, the Pope he pulled into that operation. He had to take down one Pope Boniface in order to get one of his guys in that would go along with this plan of finally taking on the most powerful banking, Gnostic, Mithraic, chivalric knighthood in the world that had controlled the majority of the sea lanes, piracy, the skull and bones imagery, for example, is a Mithraic Templar symbol used as part of the operation that also oversaw the Crusades, which is why they were first created in that form. And it seems like an esoteric inner teaching for the higher initiates was also available, which pissed off a lot of people, correctly so, because it seems to be tied to Satanism. And after a number of whistleblowers came out and enough investigations were done, and of course this has completely been skewered. Like, if you try to find this kind of history as I'm telling it right now, you'd have a tough time, because the Templars have actually been able to modify this historical interpretation to make them seem like the poor victims against the big bad King Philip le Bel and the Pope, and also King Edward II of England, who also had to collaborate with his nominal enemy of France, because England and France are often enemies. But in this case, they collaborated to take down the power structure of this massive. I mean, this is the global banking monopoly, were the Templars of the time. They would work with also sister chivalric orders like the Knights Hospitaller, both of which had been created around the same time, which seems to have some Sufi, weird Gnostic intersectionalism too, which we don't have to go into right now, but that's an interesting thing from the south of Spain. But essentially, when they were taken down, they didn't disappear, right? So some of them were killed, but a very few. We all know of Jacques de Molay and a few others. They're the famous ones who were burnt in 1317 or 1314. No, it was 1317. I think they were actually executed. But most of them migrated, some to Portugal and Spain, where they immediately set up new orders, slightly different names, but essentially with the same motifs, regalia, degrees of initiation, and mandate. Some of them went to Scotland, where they ended up working with Robert the Bruce. Yeah. And they used a lot of the tactics that they had developed during the course of the Crusades, the militia tactics and asymmetrical warfare techniques that they helped Robert the Bruce use in his battle to kick out Edward VII and create a sort of modern, not even modern, but to create an independent Scotland. That was messy in its own way, and there's more to be said in the future about that. But some of them seem to have even come to the New World, as far as I could tell. I don't know if that happened immediately, if it happened over a century later, but that also seems to be a thing. There's evidence in Nova Scotia, for example, of very old pre-Columban Templar symbolism. So that's a thing that's out there. So all that to say, some of them just emerged. They had to go underground. They kept doing their rituals, and keep in mind, these are witches. It was effectively a witch trial, but one that was actually done because there was enough evidence that they were actually carrying out black magic. So these were actually sponsors, and there's actually a book that's coming out I'm looking forward to buying by an admirer, an initiate or I think he's an initiate of one of these modern Templar orders who is going to be making the case. And he says it's great. I don't think it's great, but he's quite rigorous that the Templars were a modern witch coven, effectively, or organized as modern witch covens were. And I forgot the name of it, or it'll come to me later. But so some of them went underground, and I think one of the techniques that they brought out of their experience from Giza, from even Constantinople, where they were originally sort of formed in some way. These were people from France; they were Franks from the Norman sort of conquest period. But a lot of them developed certain insights based on their interaction with certain networks of Sufis in Spain, in certain Gnostic orders within Constantinople. They learned certain things about social engineering, about cult creation. You could even call it, as Esalen today has increasingly called it, religious engineering. That's what Willis Harman dubbed this science of religious engineering. This is the guy who wrote for Esalen. And worked with Joseph Campbell, who also advised Joseph Campbell, the guy who worked also with Esalen, who was a follower of Gurdjieff and Jiddu Krishnamurti, and Jung, who was his disciple for a period. This guy works with Willis Harman at Esalen, and they create this Changing Images of Man program in 1974. People can read it online, going through the type of psychological, spiritual reset of all of human society that they aspire to build, kind of following the Bailey, Alice Bailey agenda. So I'm saying this just to get across that this is what the techniques of religious engineering that the Templars seem to have learned and applied in creating new spin-off groups and cults that they would use to infiltrate society over the ensuing centuries. One of those things being something called the Order of the Garter. I don't know if you've heard about this, but you've heard about the Order of the Garter?
Oh, yes, the Order of the Garter. Absolutely. And that's a pretty extensive membership list right there, the Order of the Garter. I remember even Emperor Hirohito of Japan was part of the Order of the Garter.
Well, the current emperor too, Naruhito, who's the current claimant to the emperorship of Japan that they hope to bring back into play as the new monarchies are reinstated. He's also a current member of the Order of the Garter, as is Tony Blair. Now, the Order of the Garter is one of the most exclusive, powerful knighthoods in English chivalry. It was set up in 1348. Yep. Okay, now the thing about the Order of the Garter, and Yates says that the Order of the Garter is
African leaders as well. Order of the Garter.
They had a couple, but there's only 24 people allowed to be members at any given time. So 24 members plus the Prince of Wales plus the sitting monarch. That's the only permitted limit of the membership at any given time of the Order of Garter. Now, Francis Yates has made a point that the Order of Garter was a precursor to the Rosicrucians. And you could see that when you read the Chemical Wedding, which is, and I never answered your question properly, so I will be doing that. But when you read the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz, this document written by, it seems, Johann Valentin André, one of the top Rosicrucians who worked with Michael Meyer, the Phoenixing guy, and an advisor to Friedrich V, who creates the 30 Years' War. He writes the Chemical Wedding, 1618. In it, he's going through a series of initiatory rites and rituals of this knighthood, which involve also the murder of several people whose souls are deemed to be unworthy and are ritualistically killed, and also a transmigration ritual of certain souls of bodies that are dissolved in some chemical and then recombined and infused into the bodies of these two people who are then supposed to wed and create this new age. Well, anyway, there's some crazy shit. Cynthia, again, she did an amazing deep dive breaking down all of this stuff. But if you look at the rituals of the inauguration of the Order of the Garter, which actually happened in 1344, it's very similar. This is Edward III. He's the son of Edward II, the enemy of the Templars, who himself seems to have been targeted by witch covens who carried out several curses on him. And there's probably like an actual assassination. I don't think that they were deploying demons to do their bidding. I think that there was probably an assassination, and then the witches thought, hey, look, our curse worked, which is usually how it seems to go. But his son, Edward III, is really worked on psychologically to, again, he's kind of like an archetype of Frederick V later on. But so this guy, Edward, is led to believe that he is going to usher in a new age somehow. And that, but that new age requires a new organized mercenary order that he calls the Order of the Garter, New Chivalric Knights. This is effectively a new Templar order. It's under a different name. Now, when he does this in 1344, he sets up this Arthurian roundtable move. He calls it the roundtable movement. He sets up a roundtable. They do several days of jousting. There's weird ritual ceremonies that happen along the way. And it takes 4 more years for some reason for the actual organization to fully organize itself in a public setting, which happens in 1348. Now, okay, so what does he do? So in order to usher in this new age, this new promised age that he somehow led to believe it's his duty, almost like with a messianic complex, he has to unleash what's known as the 100 Years' War. Okay, so the 100 Years' War begins in 1348, just a couple of, I think, weeks after his Order of the Garter is fully announced to the public. And what happens? It's basically, he is the grandson of Philip le Bel. Philip le Bel, in order to try to get some sort of a peace deal with England that was needed to take down the Templars and also end feudalism, because that's another thing that I learned in Avignon when I went to one of the castles of Philip le Bel, is that they actually had a little summary that demonstrated that though everyone thinks that he's a bad guy, and even people living in Avignon have been led to think that he's a bad guy, they have to admit that he declared war on the feudal barons who were trying to keep serfdom and feudalism in place, and he had to stop that, and he declared a massive war against these agencies, most of whom were Templars, or at least under the Templar loyalty banner. So, to get the alliance needed to carry out the fight against this deep state complex, mostly made up of sociopathic princes who had god complexes, he had to marry off his daughter to the King of England, which was done, resulting in Edward III. Now, Edward III sees thus that I am the claimant to the throne of France. That is mine because I have the blood of the French kings. And so he goes and does it. He says, I'm the king. And already, you had many English nobles who had claimants to big chunks of land in France during that time. Why was that the case? Well, there was something called the Norman invasion. So the Norman invasion was the creation of a new oligarchist elite that happened in the 11th century. Now, the Normans, they had formed themselves in France and then were set up, and they were the Northmen. That's the name. Normans. The Northmen were the Vikings. Some of them had like a cover of using Christian language, but I think they always maintained their esoteric inner Viking pagan Gnostic.
The Norsemen, right?
The Norsemen, yeah, human sacrificing, raping, pillaging Norsemen who do evil for the sake of some worshiping of their idea of what Odin is for the esoteric inner initiates. Then they have a public teaching like they all do. But this is like what was used. This kind of like, you could imagine if you observe how Ukraine Nazis, right, are like radicalized to think of themselves as this superior, almost demonic like or godlike race that has the right to exterminate any Untermenschen, inferior beings who are not made from the same thread of whatever
Banderites
they're from. Yeah, the Banderite. It's a sect, but they're used as proxies to just do damage to the enemies of the oligarchy. So it's the same thing there too, or how ISIS is used as a proxy force to damage nations we don't like. That's how I have come to see the Normans effectively as proxies being used to undermine and damage any type of resistance to the then existent form of the high priesthood of the empire. So that's what they did. They took over Sicily first, and at the same time, simultaneously, so they went to Italy, the Norman invasion of Italy, and at the same year, just around the same period, Norman invasion of England. Norman invasion of England, again, that brought in feudalism for the first time in a serious way. It created this new class of oligarchs. And basically, a lot of them still had holdings in France. So despite having been now an English new empire, or a new not empire yet, but new English elite system, with a lot of influence, they still held their holdings in France. And so they basically had a claimant, they in their minds, to the land that they originally had taken in France. And they used that influence around King Edward III to say, okay, let's go in there and let's take back full control. We'll support you. We'll put you there and recognize you as the king. And basically that launched into the 100 Years' War. I don't even know if there's any count of how many dead people how many died during that century. It was mostly like 3 phases. It was broken up into 3 phases of forever wars. But then also when it finally ended, it didn't really end, because then you had the War of the Roses. And the War of the Roses went on for another few decades, where you had different warring factions of the Plantagenets and the.
It was so wonderful under monarchy, Matthew. It was so amazing.
It was forever wars. That was all it was, right? It probably hundreds of
forever wars and the stopping of human development.
Absolutely, there was a complete crushing of all of the optimism and all of the spirit of developing and creating a future that was better than the past. That was the spirit of those who had lived through the reforms of Charlemagne and the Carolingian Renaissance, of the Abbasids, who had a special friendship and alliance with the Carolingians, of the even Khazars, the highly slandered evil Khazars. That Jewish kingdom actually had an ecumenical alliance with the Christian and with the Muslim and with the Chinese Tang dynasty of its day, and served as one of the key conduits from the.
One of these days, we got to go through the deep dive of the Khazars and separate them from the modern day Zionists.
Yeah, sure. Well, that's all Venice. Yeah, we'll do a whole class on that if you want. Because Venice basically completely, over the course of a couple of centuries, worked to cut the Jewish population as much as they could from their Renaissance traditions and rewrite things like the Babylonian Talmud as Venice got control of the majority of printing presses after Gutenberg invented them. Mm-hmm. The first Talmuds were printed only in Venice, and the actual physical scrolls upon which the earlier Talmuds had been written were systematically destroyed. The evidence of Khazaria was systematically destroyed. Even today, there's very few physical artifacts of
about Khazaria.
Yeah, you mostly have Islamic scholars and Islamic geographers who lived at that time and wrote about it and paint a pretty nice picture, honestly, of Khazaria. It's not this evil Mordor type of place that we're often portrayed. It was actually something that seems to have been the secret sauce that allowed for this Islamic, Confucian, Chinese, Christian alliance to manage to happen that simultaneously occurred with Renaissance movements happening in all 3 of these civilizational states at the same time. Mm-hmm. And a lot of this had to do with the revival of the Silk Road that had both a southern corridor passing through the Muslim world into Charlemagne's kingdom, and a northern corridor passing through the steppes and ultimately Khazaria that had converted to Judaism and into Charlemagne's kingdom. And then you had a north-south Silk Road idea too that had happened from Khazaria down through Charlemagne's kingdom into the Muslim world. And then you have Africa also participating in a positive way at that very same time, which is also interesting and something I don't know of any good historian who's done the proper work yet, but there's definitely some good stories there. But that had to be destroyed.
Sure.
How? And that was where the next 2 centuries of Venetian ultramontanist papacy And general oligarchist collusion happened to try to get a clash of civilizations, and it required the collaboration of Gnostic orders, esoteric Gnostic orders in the Islamic world, collaborating with their so-called Christian and so-called Jewish counterparts, but that were never Christian, Jewish, or Muslim. They were always Gnostic secret societies, like the Assassins, the Nizari Ismailis, the followers of the Bahatini movement, the secret teachings of Muhammad movement. Basically, it's Kabbalistic Islam that's actually probably more esoteric Zoroastrian. That's actually, I think, probably more tied to Mithra. That was creating these new warrior cults, like, again, the Assassins.
That's Assassins.
The Hashashins, right, who would get high into an altered state as part of their ritual, and before they would then be deployed to go and carry out an assassination of somebody or some group. And they would always work, and this is even recognized. Actually, there's this interesting book called, that I'm also working on for my upcoming book, called The Templars and the Assassins by, it's called The Militia of Heaven by James Wasserman, who is himself a high-level occultist, part of the OTO today. Yeah. And so, in this, he goes through the collusion of both of these orders together, who would collaborate in killing each other's enemies to keep the crusades of forever wars going ever more, because it enriched the princes, those princes of Europe. And it kept people in a state of constant fear, terror, meat grinder, murder, death, and it normalized death. It also normalized...
Which is when you look at today's Western elites, they're obsessed with that era. They are absolutely obsessed with the Dark Ages, the neo-feudalistic ages, where it was the War of the Princes. They felt like they had much more control, and they hate where the world is right now with human advancements, with things that are completely out of their control. They can't stand it.
Yeah, and all you need to do is look at the population demographic charts to get an appreciation for the loss of life, the massive stagnation culturally and physically of the people whose population suffered so brutally during this period of forever wars of the Middle Ages, the so-called glorious Middle Ages. The loss of memory, the loss of wisdom and knowledge that was available during the time of the Carolingian Renaissance and the Abbasid and Tang Dynasty collusions, cooperations that generated these massive explosions of discoveries in medicine and astronomy, in architecture. The Carolingian architecture largely, I mean, this was an incredible feat that also is tied to internal improvements that Charlemagne had put forth. I mentioned he was the guy who first tried to do the Midi Canal. So, you had the loss of this cultural excellence as societies went stupid. They went highly superstitious. They went highly ideological, tribal. They became very localized in that sense and very inclined towards fanciful leaps into romanticism, like the chivalric.
Which is what's happening today in a lot of circles today within the Western world, because we've lost the core of who we are. We've lost the identity of what brought us here and what made us great, and the ideals and values that we've had have been obliterated. And now there's this almost like a mass mania of trying to grab and grift for concepts and things that are so skewed that people think will bring them some sort of freedom and order, but all it would do is lead us back into darkness, death, and despair.
You got it, man. No, I mean, that's the thing. And that's my fear. When you look at the promises of the current, I mean, there's a lot of people who have been drunk on the idea of a new golden age being set up by white hats and global invisible armies of an invisible college working together against the Great Black Lodge. So you have the Great White Lodge. I'm using theosophical language here. Organizing to create this new golden age, and the similarities. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't good people organizing, conspiring to do good. I'm not saying that that's not happening. But at the same measure, the similarities that I'm seeing to my investigation about what allowed for the propaganda that made the 100 Years' War possible, that happened in tandem with the organization of these higher up oligarchs and chivalric orders, or what made the Crusades happen earlier, as far as like a new promised age once we restore create the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which was the propaganda of Peter the Hermit of 1094 going around, sanctioned by the Vatican, organizing for the first, what's called the Peasants' Crusade. Turned into a friggin' bloodbath because the peasants were not trained, not equipped. They didn't know what they were doing, but tens of thousands were drunk on this propaganda and chose to follow Peter the Hermit down into the Middle East, where they got their asses massacred. Now, it just so happened that enough propaganda was put in place for Christians and especially people in the Frankish kingdom at that time to want revenge from the horrors of the evil, bad, villainous Muslims who killed all of their fellow compatriots and Christians. And so they got their revenge by sanctioning another crusade in 1098, which was the real idea the whole time, but it needed the support largely of many people who were on the fence earlier on that required the bloodbath to win over their conviction to support such a cause, which finally resulted in what? The creation of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in today's Gaza. And that Templar-managed Kingdom of Jerusalem became an organizing fixture. This is why the Templars themselves called themselves the Knights of the Order of Solomon's Temple. So the point of the order was built around a mystique. Their headquarters were in Solomon's stables under the Dome of the Rock today. That was their headquarters. They were and they were sanctioned to have access to that. I think it was the Fatimid, the Ismaili Fatimid dynasty that was like basically working with the assassins. The assassins, the Hashishins, were the ones who had provided the framework around which the Templars would be organized with their same initiatory degrees, colors, emblems, methodology, and they gave them the authorization to go and set up shop there. Now, why would a Muslim kingdom give authorization to a crusader order devoted to go to war with the Muslim kingdom? Why would that even happen? Well, it's because there's something. It wouldn't unless there was something evil working within the governance structures of both worlds, which is what happened. Now, once that happened, then you could grow the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which happened until the end of the 13th century. And if you look at it today, this is what's behind the creation of the Third Temple cult, or even Israel itself as a state. It's entirely built around these chivalric, roundtable, romanticist Gnostics like Edward VII, who oversaw the Palestinian Expedition Fund in 1862, with Sir Charles Warren and Sir Walter Besant, the handler and brother-in-law of Annie Besant, who ends up running the Theosophist movement, as well as the Fabians. She's a big level Fabian, but also a Theosophist leader, follower of Blavatsky. So this guy is the treasurer of the Palestinian Exploration Fund under Edward VII, who gets a tattoo of the Templar kingdom on his chest when he goes to Jerusalem for the first time in 1862 with Charles Warren. And he emulates himself on Richard the Lionheart and Edward III. That's his archetypal role models. This is the guy he's then prince, and he becomes King Edward VII a little bit later on when Victoria dies. But this is the foundation of what creates the Quatuor Coronati Lodge, the Freemasonic research lodge that carries out all of the excavations of Solomon's Temple. It's looking for the Ark of the Covenant and all of the Grail, all of the stories that basically get infused into Indiana Jones movies later on. But and Dan Brown novels. But it's basically they're basically doing a bit of a revelation of the method. That's exactly what they're just showing you that they actually believe. They believe that there's this special bloodline. Maybe it's the Sinclairs, maybe it's the Stuarts, maybe it's a bit of both, that are emanations of the blood, the sacred blood of Jesus, who they think of as being actually Lucifer. So in their mythology, they believe that there's a Gnostic, basically a Sethian figure of Lucifer that expressed itself as the Christ power that emanated as a serpent at one time as an avatar of the serpent in the Garden of Eden, that emanated itself in a different time as the figure of Enoch, that emanated itself in a different time as a figure of Jesus. But they don't believe in the Jesus that you see in the public exoteric scriptures. They don't believe in evil that you see expressed in the public exoteric scriptures as they refer to it as. They believe in the Gnostic scriptures of the Nag Hammadi, of the secret teachings of Jesus, just like the Bahatiani movement in Islam believes in the secret teaching of Muhammad, just like the Kabbalists that emerged out of Templar frauds of scrolls supposedly brought back from Gaza in the 13th or 12th century by the Templars, were the Zohar. the key to interpreting and understanding the coded messaging and secret spiritual alchemy that is Kabbalah. So, which is secret teachings of Moses, right? And so both practical and applied and theoretical, but it's all the same thing. It's all secret teachings that basically becomes a game of telephone of whoever the fuck makes up what, whoever has power, right, to forge a document and make it sound like it's ancient. Or like the case of the Rosicrucians, which gets at your original questions of like, what are the Rosicrucians? Well, it's based on this mythology. They love mythology of this high enlightened being named Christian Rosenkreutz, who never existed and who supposedly was born in like 1348 and died 100 plus years later, and has a secret burial site somewhere in the world that becomes one of the quests, I think, for young initiates or old initiates or whatever, who get tapped on the shoulder and are put on a quest, an Arthurian Grail quest. As all of the Grail quests written in the medieval ages under the sponsorship of people like Eleanor Aquitaine or Elizabeth of what's her face. Anyway, but the ISIS priestess witches, basically, but they sponsored all of these romantic troubadour tales that became the foundation of the myths of Lancelot, Arthur, that have nothing to do with the real Arthur, by the way, who seems to be an awesome human being from the 6th century. But these are nothing to do with that. These were completely designed to be modern mystery plays that would help facilitate the initiation ceremony and psychological organization of young, mushy idiots who would then become knights to be deployed and also sacrificed at different times by their masters. So all that to say, this is the type of propaganda, this is the type of world that the Rosicrucians created or came up with. They had this tale that didn't exist of a person who didn't exist, but it created like a fertile soil for the imagination to create all sorts of phantasms. Very good for brainwashing. And they use certain imagery like the Rosy Cross, which has a variety. In this realm, things can mean different things at the same time and all still be true at different degrees of awareness. Whether it's the red cross of the Templars, whether it's the rose and the cross of a certain Sufi order that came out of Giza, and that had some connections to Bernard de Clairvaux. There's a number of different ways of looking at the thing and what meaning is behind the various symbols of the rose, of the cross, of the spider, and of the bee that they also like infusing together in their imagery. And again, which my wife Cynthia is doing a crazy, interesting, deep dive set of studies on right now, which are on her Substack. But then what this order then becomes is later on the Royal Society of England. So by the end of the British, so here's the thing, right? I mentioned that you had the 30 Years' War that was ended in 1648 that established the foundations of the modern nation state. This is not even taught properly in school, but this is what people like Tony Blair, who is a member of the Order of Garter, by the way, Tony Blair, who's in charge currently of the Gaza so-called technocratic regime that's supposed to be part of a peace plan. It's Tony Blair is overseeing this thing. The order of the guy who is one of the few members of the Order of the Garter is overseeing this thing in what some wish to become the new Temple of Jerusalem, or the new Kingdom of Jerusalem. Once again, even Steve Bannon, who's a big promoter of this Crusader ideology against, forever wars against Islam and Chinese communism, Steve Bannon has even said that we need to introduce the idea of a 3-state solution, which involves restoring the Kingdom of Jerusalem into the Middle East. So
3 states.
3-state solution. That was Steve Bannon.
Israel, Palestine, and Jerusalem.
And Christianity, yeah, like the Christian, Muslim, and the Jewish kingdom. But ultimately, I think what they want is for the Jews and the Muslims to wipe themselves out and then have a restored central command center to better do battle with the emerging Eurasian nations of Russia, and especially of China and India. And that having that command center that's a little bit closer to that field, it's a strategic center. Whoever controls that has a really good ability to keep Eurasia in a state of turmoil, unconnected also from Africa. So I think they want that beachhead there. And so the mystique that they've built up around the temple and other things is all just very useful to get towards the ultimate objective. Now, what I'm saying here is that they then do that. So you have the 30 Years' War ends. The nation state is created. That's a miracle into itself. I know some people out there have been induced to hate the 30 Years' War, but they're people who I think have a lot in common with Tony Blair, who gave a number of speeches, like his Chicago speech in 1999, setting up the stage for 9/11, where he calls for a post-Westphalian world order founded on a supranational regime. And in the mind of the Blairites, what they want is a supranational regime that would be needed under their like responsibility to protect protocols that were embedded into the United Nations security protocols in 1999 or 2001 even, under people like Lord Malloch Brown, who played a big role as the Assistant Secretary General of the UN that infused that into there, that gives the right for
George Soros's handler.
Yeah. And that gives the right, Smartmatic guy, right? And that gives the right for nations to intervene for the first time. This was largely done because of the excuse of the Rwandan massacre, and then the attack on the trade centers that we were told were being done by Islamic fascists, somehow tied to Iran and Iraq. So we needed to now have the right to go and ignore the idea of the sovereign nation state and begin to do interventions. Responsibility to protect was the name. And that meant no more Westphalia. And so Kissinger gave a number of speeches on the need to overthrow the Westphalian order. Now, by the way, Kissinger was also a member of a chivalric order knighted by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, called the Order of St. George and Michael, St. Michael and St. George, in 1992 for services rendered to the empire. The year later, you had George Herbert Walker Bush, who was also knighted by Her Majesty and made a knight of the Order of St. Michael and St. George as well. Just to say, former CIA director, president, warmonger, and warmonger stooge, little turd, Kissinger, both made initiates of the Order of St. Michael and St. George. Just saying. So all that to say, they're calling for the end of the Westphalian order, the end of the nation state, and the creation of a dual supranational set of controls at the one hand, and a bottom up set of micro city states, kind of like new Genoas, new little mini Venices, new little mini venture capital run mini states with a lord, a feudal lord of some form that would then oversee little micro areas of plantations around the world. Now it's called, many names have been given to this thing, it's still underdeveloped, but you could see thoroughly what the followers of Peter Thiel, what he invests in, Civium, what that product is, seasteading, which is making a big comeback, all these little ideas to get rid of the network states idea as well. So they've got all of these ideas with Silicon Valley initiated occultist transhumanist billionaires obsessed about antichrists, alien gods, and other things, who are positioned right now to be the handlers of the new set of micronations managed by a top-down grid. So this is not unprecedented. This is what you had coming, like that initiated all of these fires. This is what initiated the Civil War in England. If you want to know, if anybody wants to know what initiated the Civil War in England, you got to look at this thing. It's everywhere there too. You had Rosicrucians left and right out of the wazoo, making sure that the aspirations of the genuine Republicans that wanted to create a world that would be broken free of the system of oligarchism would not be successful, and that the good and the bad alike would lose their heads in what became effectively an oligarchist shit show with people. We all know what happened to the English Civil War, but it didn't end well. Same thing for the French Revolution. If you don't look at these Rosicrucian oligarchists in France, people like Cagliostro, the founder of the Memphis Freemasonic Egyptian Rite. If you don't look at Saint Germain, also an ally of Cagliostro all over the case in France, orchestrating the bloodbath that becomes the French Revolution, which is effectively a phoenixing operation of Solve et Coagula. That's all it is, to make sure that American Revolution does not replicate itself in the mainland Europe. And it nearly did, but it was not allowed, and they didn't allow it. And they lit it on fire with soft-headed idiots who didn't know what the game was about and walked right into trap after trap that they should not have done. And the whole thing turned into a civil war for 5 years, millions dead, and simultaneously global external wars abroad, culminating in the figure of a Napoleon Bonaparte a Napoleon Bonaparte who declares himself world emperor, who sees himself as kind of like an antichrist figure of some sort, of some Apollonian solar deity, which he does, who tries to create his new French version of an Anglican church with himself as the head of it, this, Gallic church, and has this aspiration to rebuild Solomon's temple in the Middle East, utilizing the Jews, that he calls himself the protector of the Jews. For why? Does he actually love the Jews? No, I don't think he actually, I think he hates the Jews. But I think at the same time, he sees them as politically expedient to generate the control that you want to have inside of the Middle East, which he tries to do. And, all of these things, history becomes so much more interesting, is all I'm trying to say, when you look at it from this interesting perspective, and then you start seeing so many parallels of how this trap has been framed, targeting certain groups today who could feasibly go crazy if their dreams of a new golden age are taken away from them, and they could become the thing that they currently think that they could never become, as far as radicalized killers. Especially in the context of an economic breakdown that is also being orchestrated over the course of decades by those same figures that killed Kennedy. So I could see the stage being set up. The game is rigged. People got to really be careful and really, really know their shit right now. And I'm hoping that I could do what little I can to amplify the awareness and the consciousness about like what worked to overcome Rosicrucian traps, which, by the way, I didn't even mention this, but they became the Invisible College. That's
Describe to the people what the Invisible College is, because a lot of the people that are listeners, they don't know, or they're hearing it about the first time.
Right after the English Civil War was finished, you had a merger of the monarchists and so-called anti-monarchists together, who set up an entity that created a new control mechanism to control the real battlefield, because more important than the physical battlefield is the battlefield of the soul and the mind. And that was the domain of science in the day. So the Invisible College was the conduit given, the name given by people like Francis Boyle, not Francis Boyle, sorry, forgive Francis Boyle, Francis Bale and Boyle, forgot the first name, but there is a Boyle in there.
Francis Boyle or Francis Bacon?
No, they're followers of Francis Bacon, but Boyle is the last name. So Francis Boyle is the recently deceased good guy, sure. Exposed a lot of bioweaponry. But there's another Boyle whose first name I'm all of a sudden forgetting, who was a handler, one of several handlers of the cardboard cutout Isaac Newton later on, who becomes the Grand Master of the Mint of the Bank of England with the Dutch invasion of England. And Newton, from the president of the Invisible College, basically the name was the Royal Society of England, sponsored by, at the time, at first, Charles II, the Stuart Restoration King, or the Stuart King that was restored after the Civil War. He sponsors this thing. Francis Bacon is their sort of icon, who's featured on their first emblems and history books about themselves. So Bacon is key. What they basically want to do is consolidate control of all science and reinterpret science from a way which is favorable to the control mechanism of the British Empire. And so what that means is they need to steal the ideas, the creative Renaissance ideas that are being made by real, brilliant, sublime people and minds like Gottfried Leibniz on the continent, the Bernoulli brothers, Christian Huygens, Johannes Kepler from Germany actually studied in Prague, or worked in Prague for Rudolf II, which is interesting, and I got to see some of that area too. But the people who were making discoveries of universals and applying them in the form of the new power of technological improvement and new ideas of political economy directly, like Gottfried Leibniz is not just the discoverer of the infinitesimal calculus and a follower of Kepler, but he's also the founder of the school of the science of physical economy. He writes Science and Economy back in like 1771 when he's a young man, and he adds to this thesis that you have to be able to achieve a cultural level of excellence such that the domain of the arts and of the sciences and of the well-being of society, of the aspiration of political freedom, all are able to be harmonized together into what he called the queen of all sciences, or what Benjamin Franklin later on called the science of happiness, which they understood to be economy. Now, economy is not about making money, maximizing profit, buying low, selling dear, any of the crap you're given from the Newtonian British school of economists, which includes the Scottish schools of Adam Smith and David Hume, who all misdefine completely and they basically invert economics to make the least important aspect of it, which involves the money-making side of things, the pricing theory, interest rate theory. They make that superficial aspect become the dominant feature of their theories, and the actual substance of the real science of economy, which is tied to the well-being of human beings, both as a collective as well as individuals, and the creative powers of the individual to make new discoveries and translate those discoveries into new inventions that improve the next generation. All of that is destroyed in the British empirical schools following the organizational assumptions of Isaac Newton in general, presuming such things as empty space, action at a distance, things like that creates a tension, which you could see in Bernard Mandeville and then later on Adam Smith's theories of what are the markets, what causes innovation, as far as a general state of tension caused by a vacuum, or that's a vacuum caused by the sucking in of individual atoms called people, consumers, who are essentially greedy in their core nature, that want to maximize their pleasure and avoid pain, as Adam Smith lays out in his theory of moral sentiments. That's all human beings are animated by, is a desire to maximize pleasure, minimize pain, and not think about the greater good or the future. That's the realm for God to think about, and not the realm for mortals to trespass upon, says Adam Smith. Instead, we have to presume that this tension caused by the pushing and pulling of atoms in a vacuum is being organized by some invisible hidden hands that somehow organize goodness, which is, again, a really, really great way for the oligarchy to keep fucking us over and to not get us to look at the man behind the curtain, because we presume that mystical forces, whether AI or whether, artificial intelligence, systems of self-conscious machines are controlling us, or aliens are doing it, or a bit of both, or just invisible forces that are beyond the realm of the human mind to think about. But we'll never trespass our minds to go beyond the curtain to hold the oligarchy accountable for the crimes that they want to do to us, as long as they have different varieties of the exact same thing basically in play. So again, that's what the Invisible College, what the Royal Society was set up to do. People who might be offended because they think Isaac Newton was such a great guy, I got to tell you, I've done a lot of work on this question. I didn't believe it until I did the work on it. I encourage other people. I encourage other people to read this book. It's Christmas is Coming, Volume 2 of my 3-volume Revenge of the Mystery Cults, Rosicrucian Golem, which features Isaac Newton right there on the cover. He's a Rosicrucian Golem. Basically, the Golem of Prague, that story of the Kabbalistic rabbi that wanted to make a lifeless body of clay become, a Frankenstein monster in defense of his people, by incanting certain rituals into it and programming it like a machine to just do its thing, and then it goes on a rampage. Well, that's basically what this human, automata of Sir Isaac Newton, who is the closest thing I could think of, is a golem. And he himself saw himself as a messiah-like figure. He writes about himself in the first person. He wants people to call him, who are in his inner core, including his boyfriend, Jehovah. He's doing only alchemical rituals. All of the scientific work that's been preserved from his hand, demonstrating what sorts of experiments he was devoting his years of so-called scientific work towards. All of that which has survived only shows us mountainous bodies of millions of pages of alchemical workings trying to create the false philosopher's stone, probably doing a lot of psychedelic drugs along the way, a lot of numerology trying to calculate the end times using the Book of Daniel and the Book of Revelations to do mathematical calculations around how the world is organized by around 400-year cycles of periodic necessary points of destruction. And that, one should be then thus coming up sometime in the 21st century, according to their calculations. Not like they're going to do anything to actually make it happen, right? It's going to be God doing it, right? So anyway, that's what Isaac Newton is. And he's basically stealing his ideas. And I don't think he's even doing it. I think he's got handlers. There's a whole team of these Rosicrucians who are using him. He's well known as a rabid, antisocial, sociopathic autist. He takes pleasure. He takes pleasure while he's the master of the mint of the Bank of England in watching torture of counterfeiters of coins, who mostly get the death penalty, but first have to be tortured under his control. So this guy is a sick SOB, and he's not full. He's never allowed to speak publicly in defense of his own so-called brilliant theories outlined in his Principia Mathematica. Not once is he ever allowed, even though he's challenged, to debate them. He's asked to prove how he makes his encyclopedic discoveries, but he never does it even once. Other people do, like, for example, Samuel Clarke, a Rosicrucian handler who seems to organize all of the data in his book and is the one who's actually debating Gottfried Leibniz in the last couple of years of Gottfried Leibniz's death. And Leibniz wants to talk to Newton. Hell, Leibniz almost became Prime Minister of England under Queen Sophie of the Electress of Hanover. He actually organized one of his disciples that he had trained to become a philosopher queen. Right? This guy worked hard for years to train people to become the philosopher kings they needed to be, or queens in this case. And one of his key students nearly became the Queen of England, which would have brought him in likely as prime minister at a time when England was being consolidated to become the seat of power projection for the New World Empire. At that very time, he was about to do that. So this guy was not just a theoretician or a philosopher. He was doing battle. He was he made himself privy counselor. He got himself a job as the privy counselor of Peter the Great in Russia, and was brought up by Peter the Great to map out an economic development program for Russia, which he does. And all of Leibniz's programs become the foundation of the Russian Academy of Sciences, of the Russian Academy of Music and of Arts, and of all of the mining projects that Leibniz lays out, and how you're going to do it, and how you're going to develop an industrial power and machine tool power where you currently don't have any. And Peter the Great is a confused guy. He's disorganized, but he recognizes talent when he sees it and is able to deploy the Leibnizian strategy quite well. Leibniz is a correspondent with John Winthrop Jr. in the New World. He's organizing to create a strategy whereby a lot of these new colonists, these Puritans who had just been recently settled right after the 30 Years' War began, by the way, not a coincidence, in order to understand the occult networks of witch covens, of antinomianists, of other, Rosicrucian satanic sects that had been infested into the New World to try to do what John Dee and Francis Bacon want the New World to be, as a seat of a new global satanic empire. And yet you have Leibniz, who's organizing John Winthrop Jr., the Mathers, to understand and to do battle with this thing, which they effectively end up doing quite well, surprisingly so, despite all of the sabotage against them by Charles II and so many programs to destroy their efforts to create a genuine new type of society founded on natural law and the rejection of the divine right of kings. So again, I mean, that's what allowed, knowing that battle, that again was made possible by Gottfried Leibniz, you could appreciate why it's like Leibniz was more than the guy who just discovered the calculus. And you could appreciate the fear that the oligarchy had, and they wouldn't allow Newton to debate him. They had to use a handler, the way that Charles Darwin later on, the other, autistic cardboard cutout for the Royal Society, well over a century later, 2 centuries later, had a handler in the form of Thomas Huxley. Yeah. He couldn't actually debate or defend his theories in public. He needed a Thomas Huxley to do that for him, because he didn't really understand his own theories, that he was being used as a surface person. I think in the same way that Elon Musk or Peter Thiel or Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates are clearly cardboard cutouts who we think of as being brilliant because they have so much money and there's so much propaganda and reputation built up around their image as a brand. But if you actually listen to them speak and you look at their actual story, it doesn't take long to realize there's nothing there. They're just military intelligence children from vetted families who are used and have tons of ego that they probably think maybe they're awesome. Like Newton thought he was awesome. Descartes thought he was awesome. Jesuit Descartes working with the Rosicrucians thought he was awesome. Though I don't think that any of the things that actually had value in their so-called discoveries were actually made by them. It was just repackaged shit made by real people who are real thinkers and not them. So, it's a golem thing. They're basically human computers. And to that degree, I'm hoping that people pick up again, shameless plug time, Revenge of the Mystery Cults, Volume 1, 2, and 3 for Christmas for yourself, your friends, and your family. Just throwing that out there as my shameless plug.
Lots to dig into. And folks, I'm telling you right now, go back and listen to this broadcast yet again. There's a lot of information here, and take notes. And most importantly, get the book. It's so vital as we are in an incredible state of flux right here in the Western civilization. And there's so many forces pulling us and prodding us and poking us into all sorts of different directions. We need to understand who the hell we are, where we're from, and where we're going, and to get to the bedrock of what human civilization is all about and what is best for human advancement and development. And I think Matthew spells it out better than anyone that I know personally. And so with that being said, folks, we are at the end of the show. Thank you all for listening in. We'll be back tomorrow. Keep it locked and loaded right here, roguenews.com.